The newspaper boys called it a splendid little war. That's what John Hay said, Secretary of State, sitting comfortable in Washington. Splendid. Little. Tell that to the boys who never came home. I'm sitting here in 1938, 40 years after the fact, and people still think it was some grand adventure. The Spanish-American War, Cuba and Puerto Rico. Remember the Maine, they said. 4 months of fighting and we became an empire. Splendid. They don't ask about the boys who drowned before they even reached the beach. Don't ask about the ones who died shitting themselves from typhoid in tent hospitals. Don't ask what it's like to charge up a hillside into Spanish Mausers when you're carrying a single-shot Springfield that jams in the heat. My name is John Michael Riley. I was 21 years old when I enlisted in the 6th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry in May of 1898. The whole country had war fever after the Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. They said Spain murdered 266 American sailors. Said we had to avenge them. Had to free Cuba, had to show the world that America was a real power now. I believed it all, every word. I grew up in South Boston, worked the docks with my father. Irish Catholic family, 6 kids, never had much. The Army seemed like a way out, a way to prove myself, maybe see something beyond the same gray harbor I'd looked at my whole life. When the war started, half the neighborhood enlisted together. We were going to be heroes, going to whip the Spanish in a few weeks and come home to parades. We trained at Camp Alger in Virginia for 6 weeks. Learned to march, learned to shoot, sort of. They gave us wool uniforms designed for fighting Indians in Montana. Heavy, dark blue wool. We were heading to the tropics. Should have known right then that someone didn't know what the hell they were doing. By July, we were on transport ships heading for Puerto Rico. The newspapers said the Spanish garrison was weak, that they'd surrender quickly. Easy victory. Splendid little war. The landing at Guanica on July 25th, 1898, taught me different. We'd been on the transport ship Stillwater for 5 days, packed in like sardines. Over 800 men crammed into a vessel meant for cargo, not soldiers. The heat below deck was suffocating. Men were already sick before we even reached Puerto Rico. Seasickness, dysentery, heat exhaustion. The latrines were overflowing. The smell was ungodly. They kept us in those wool uniforms the whole time. Dark blue, heavy as sin. We were sweating through them constantly, and there was no way to wash or dry them. By the 3rd day, everyone stank. By the 5th, men were passing out from heat stroke just standing on deck. We approached Guanica Harbor at dawn on July 25th, a small port on the southern coast of Puerto Rico. The town looked peaceful from the ship, white buildings with red tile roofs, palm trees swaying in the breeze, fishing boats in the harbor, almost pretty if you didn't think too hard about what came next. General Miles, he was in command, he told us it would be unopposed, said the Spanish had abandoned the position. We'd just walk ashore, establish a beachhead, and begin the march inland. Simple. But they didn't know for sure. That was the thing. Nobody really knew where the Spanish were or how many of them there were. Intelligence was practically non-existent. We were going in blind. They loaded us into the landing boats around 6 in the morning. Small wooden boats that held maybe 30 men each, rowed by sailors. We climbed down rope ladders on the side of the transport ship, weighed down with rifles, ammunition, haversacks, canteens. The boats were rocking in the swell, and men were losing their grip, falling into the water. I watched Private Murphy, kid from Dorchester, couldn't swim, go into the water between the boat and the ship's hull. The boat swung back in with the wave. I heard the sound it made when it crushed him against the steel hull. A sound I won't forget. They didn't even stop to pull him out. Too dangerous. His body just floated there as we rowed toward shore. That was before anyone fired a shot. The closer we got to the beach, the quieter everyone got. You could hear the oars creaking, the water lapping against the boats, men breathing hard. Some were praying. Some were just staring at the town, waiting to see if the buildings would erupt in rifle fire. My hands were shaking. I gripped my Springfield tighter, trying to stop the trembling. Didn't work. We were maybe 200 yards from the beach when the first shots came. Crack, 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 crack. Rifle fire from the buildings near the waterfront. Spanish soldiers, maybe a dozen of them, firing from windows and doorways. The Mauser rifles they carried had a distinctive sound, sharper, faster than our Springfields. More modern, too. They could fire 5 rounds to our 1. The first bullet hit the man next to me. Corporal James Delaney from Southie. We'd grown up 3 streets apart. The round caught him in the throat, and he just toppled backward into the water without making a sound. 1 second he was there, the next he was gone, blood spreading in the water around where he'd fallen. Everyone started yelling at once. The sailors rowing were trying to pull harder, trying to get us to shore faster. Men were ducking down in the boats, which just made them rock worse. Someone dropped his rifle overboard. Another man was screaming for his mother. Our lieutenant, Lieutenant Harrison, Boston Brahmin type who'd never seen combat. He was standing up in the boat shouting orders that nobody could hear over the gunfire and the chaos. A bullet punched through the wooden side of our boat, right at the waterline. Water started pouring in. We were taking on water and still 150 yards from shore. "Bail!" someone shouted. Men started using their canteens, their mess kits, anything to scoop water out of the boat, but more kept coming in. Another bullet hole appeared, then another. The boat next to ours took a direct hit. Not sure if it was rifle fire or if they had a cannon somewhere. It just exploded into splinters. 30 men went into the water, weighed down with equipment. Most of them couldn't swim. I watched them thrashing, going under, screaming. The sailors tried to pull some out, but there were too many. Most just drowned. I counted 12 men go under, 12. Never even made it to the beach. Our boat finally hit the shallows about 50 yards out. "Go! Go! Go!" the lieutenant was screaming. We jumped out into waist-deep water, rifles held over our heads, wading toward the beach. The water was warm, too warm, like bath water. And still the Mausers were cracking from the buildings. Private Tommy O'Brien, kid who'd just turned 18, went down next to me. Shot through the chest. He fell face first into the water, and I had to step over him because there was no time to stop. No time to help. Just keep moving or you'd be next. The beach was white sand that burned even through our boots. We ran, best we could in soaked wool uniforms that must have weighed 50 pounds each, toward whatever cover we could find. A stone wall, some wooden crates, anything. I threw myself behind a low wall and tried to work the bolt on my Springfield. Jammed. The damn thing was full of sand and seawater, and it wouldn't cycle. I was fumbling with it, trying to clear it, when I saw the Spanish soldiers pulling back. They weren't making a stand, just a rear guard, firing a few rounds and then retreating inland. Smart. Make us pay for every yard. By the time we secured the beach, we'd lost 23 men, dead or drowned. 23 men before we'd advanced a single mile inland. The officers called it a successful landing. Light casualties, they said. I sat on that beach, soaked through, my rifle useless, and I looked at Tommy O'Brien's body washing up in the surf. Light casualties. He was 18 years old. We thought the Spanish were the enemy. Turns out the real enemy was the island itself. The heat. Jesus Christ, the heat. It must have been 95 degrees with humidity that made the air feel like soup. And we're still wearing those goddamn wool uniforms. Dark blue wool designed for temperate climates. Within an hour of being on shore, men were dropping from heat exhaustion. We hadn't even started marching yet. They made us dig in, establish defensive positions around the beachhead, digging in that sand, in that heat, wearing wool. It was torture. Men were vomiting, passing out. The company surgeon was running around trying to treat heat stroke cases while we waited for supplies to come ashore. Supplies. That's a joke. The Army had no idea how to run an amphibious operation. Landing boats were bringing in ammunition when we needed water. Food crates that had been sitting in the sun for hours, spoiling in the heat. Medical supplies that never arrived. It was chaos. By the second day, the real killer showed up. Disease, yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, typhoid. Take your pick. Within a week, more men were in the sick tent than were fit for duty. I watched Private Eddie Sullivan, tough kid from Chelsea, never complained about anything, waste away from typhoid over the course of 10 days. Started with a fever, then the diarrhea, then delirium. By the end, he was just skin and bones, lying in his own filth, calling for his mother. He died on August 3rd, never fired his rifle at a Spanish soldier, never saw combat, killed by bacteria. The sick tent was worse than the landing. At least at the landing, it was quick. In the sick tent, you died slowly. The smell alone was enough to make you sick. Human waste, vomit, the sweet, sour smell of yellow fever patients. We didn't have enough doctors, didn't have enough medicine, didn't have enough of anything. I got malaria around August 5th. Started with chills, which sounds impossible in that heat, but I was shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. Then came the fever, then the sweating. Then the whole cycle would start over again. It felt like my brain was cooking inside my skull. I was one of the lucky ones. I survived. But I was out of action for 2 weeks, lost 20 pounds. By the time I could stand again, the war was practically over. Most of the Puerto Rico campaign happened without me. I was too busy trying not to die in a tent. On August 12th, 1898, they signed an armistice. The war was over. Spain had surrendered. We'd been in Puerto Rico for 18 days. 18 days. We'd barely fought the Spanish. A few skirmishes here and there, some long-range shooting. Most of the campaign was just marching through jungle in wool uniforms, setting up camps, and watching men die of disease. The Spanish garrison at San Juan never even saw serious combat. They just gave up. The whole thing was over before it really began. I was still sick when they told us. Lying in that tent, sweating through another round of fever, and someone came in saying we'd won. We'd won. I looked around at the rows of dying men, boys from Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania, wasting away from diseases that had nothing to do with Spanish bullets, and I couldn't make sense of it. What had we won exactly? Out of my company, 120 men who landed at Guanica, we lost 8 to combat. 8. But we lost 34 to disease. 34. Yellow fever, typhoid, malaria, dysentery. They died in tents, delirious, calling for home. That's the ratio nobody talks about. For every man killed in combat, 4 died from disease. But the newspapers didn't care about that. They wanted stories about charging up hills, about brave boys with bayonets. They didn't want to hear about Private Eddie Sullivan shitting himself to death in a tent. When we finally shipped home in September, half the regiment was too sick to walk. They had to carry us onto the transport ships. The voyage back was worse than the voyage there. More men died on the way home than died in actual combat. I made it back to Boston in October, lost 40 pounds, had malaria relapses for the next 2 years. But I was alive, which was more than I could say for a lot of the boys I'd enlisted with. They threw us a parade. People cheered, waved flags, called us heroes, thanked us for liberating Puerto Rico and Cuba, thanked us for defeating the Spanish Empire. I stood there in that parade, barely able to stand, watching people celebrate, And all I could think about was Tommy O'Brien washing up on that beach. Private Murphy crushed between the boat and the ship. Eddie Sullivan calling for his mother. Splendid little war. That's what they called it. I call it a waste. 40 years later, I'm 61 years old. I've got a bad leg from the malaria. Never did get my strength back completely. The fevers still come sometimes, even now. I'll be fine for months, then wake up in the middle of the night, shaking, sweating, right back in that tent in Puerto Rico. I went back to the docks after the war, worked alongside my father until he died in 1912, got married, had 3 kids, tried to live a normal life. But there's parts of me that never left that beach at Guanica. People ask me about the war sometimes, not often. It was 40 years ago, ancient history to most folks. But occasionally someone finds out I was there, and they want to hear about it. Want to hear about the glory, the adventure, the time America became a world power. I don't tell them what they want to hear. I tell them about Private Murphy, crushed between the boat and the ship before we even reached shore. About Corporal Delaney, shot in the throat in the landing boats. About Tommy O'Brien, 18 years old, face down in the surf. About Eddie Sullivan dying of typhoid, calling for his mother. I tell them that we won Puerto Rico in 18 days, and it cost us more dead from disease than from Spanish bullets. I tell them about wool uniforms in the tropics, about rifles that jammed with sand, about an army that had no idea what it was doing, sending boys to die not from enemy fire, but from incompetence and disease. Most people don't want to hear it. They want the story from the newspapers. Brave American boys liberating oppressed colonies from Spanish tyranny. They want Theodore Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. They want Remember the Maine. They don't want to remember the boys who drowned, who died shitting themselves in tents, who came home broken and never quite fit back into the world they'd left. My youngest son, Patrick, he's 17 now, talks about joining the military, says there's trouble brewing in Europe, says America might have to get involved. He looks at me with those young eyes, same eyes I had in 1898, and asks if war is really that bad. I tell him yes. Tell him it's worse than bad. Tell him that if war comes, and it looks like it will, he should run the other direction. But I know he won't listen, just like I didn't listen, just like none of us listened. The newspapers will print their headlines. The politicians will give their speeches, and boys will line up to enlist, thinking they're going to be heroes, thinking it'll be quick, thinking it'll be glorious. They'll call it whatever they want, a great war, a war to end all wars. But it'll be the same as it always was. Boys dying far from home, dying from bullets, from disease, from incompetence, dying for reasons that'll seem important at the time and meaningless years later. I survived the Spanish-American War, but I left pieces of myself on that beach at Guanica, left them with Tommy O'Brien and Murphy and Delaney and all the rest. 40 years later, I'm still trying to figure out what we died for. Still trying to make sense of that splendid little war. I don't think I ever will.